girl looked at the minister in terror and pleading. She didn't want to be sold to the mean-looking Frenchman. Finally, the minister made his last bid. He looked over at the Frenchman. The Frenchman said, "I'm done." The gavel came down and the girl fell in a heap. "Well," said the auctioneer, "you're a minister. Now that you've bought this girl, what are you going to do with her?" Later on, I learned that the minister's name was Fairbanks and that he was one of the leaders of the anti-slavery movement in Ohio. He stood up in the midst of that crowd in Louisiana and he said, "I am going to free her." I've since learned that the minister spent 17 years in the state penitentiary for his anti-slavery activities. Well, he was lucky, because leaders of anti-slavery movements in Louisiana and in other southern states had been hanged, not just sent to the penitentiary, but killed for what they were doing. Slavery ran the iron into me then and there. I told my friend, I said, if I ever get a chance to hit this thing, slavery, I'm going to hit it hard. And that's why now I'm thinking about this Emancipation Proclamation. You know, when I was in my early 20s, we moved to Illinois. I lived there in the village of New Salem. And in New Salem, well, I did just about everything I can think of. For a while, I was the postmaster. For a while, I helped run a grocery store. For a while, I did some surveying. For a while, I did just about anything I could, going out to people's farms and splitting rails for them, if that's what it took. Anything to get by. One day, as I was coming back from splitting rails, and just me, I was coming back, I was wearing a red shirt that day, as I recall, and had my axe slung over my shoulder, when down through the field I saw a lone figure approaching me. It was a young black man, probably about my age. I looked at him, and I wondered, what is he doing out here in Illinois all by himself? In New Salem, you didn't see a black person very often. And as he came, I looked at him, and I said, I'd like to know his story. Well, I suppose not too many people do that, but I was curious, and so I went up to him and I said, "Stranger, what are you doing in these parts?" And he began to tell me the most amazing story I had ever heard. He told me his name was Billy. William de Flourville, he said, but he said, "Just call me Billy." He was a Haitian. He had come from the country of Haiti when he was just a boy. They'd been having a revolution there. And his godmother said, before young Billy gets killed, we've got to get out of the country. And so they came to the United States of America. They came to Baltimore, where there was a Haitian community. Unfortunately, my new friend Billy, his godmother died. And so he was all alone. A young boy in a new country with no one that he knew. He stayed for a while with some sisters at a convent, and then finally they said he has to be turned over to an orphanage. And so what they called the Orphans Court said, "Billy, you've got to do something with your life. You're going to be a barber." And so they apprenticed him. That means he would work for a barber until he learned how to be a barber himself. That's what Billy did. Until finally he was a pretty good barber. But he was tired of Baltimore, and he was tired of being an apprentice. Being an apprentice in those days was not quite, but almost like being a slave. You didn't get paid anything. You did whatever the master told you to do. You just hoped that someday down the road the master would say, "You're old enough to have your own freedom." And so he was tired of his near servitude there in New England. And so he came down the river, just like me. He went down the Mississippi River thinking he would go to New Orleans, just like I did, because he had heard there was a large Haitian community in New Orleans that might take him in. But he got down into the southern states, and all of a sudden he realized that it was not the safest thing for a young black man to be traveling down in those parts of the country. He was afraid that somebody would take his papers of freedom away from him and take him to a plantation somewhere and put him to work and never let him have his freedom again. And so he came back north. And when I met him, wandering through the fields of Illinois, he was penniless, had nothing left in the world. Well, where are you going to sleep tonight? I asked Billy. I don't know, Mr. Lincoln, I said. I have no idea where I'm going to sleep. Well, I said, Billy, I'm staying over at the Rutledge Tavern. It was just an inn where everybody would stay. There was no bedrooms that everybody had. We just all stayed in one big room at the top of the inn. I said, Billy, you come with me. I've got a bed that is not very big. In fact, it's hardly big enough for me since I'm so tall. But you can share it with me, and that would be fine. So sure enough, Billy came home with me that night. And I introduced him to all the other people staying at the Rutledge Tavern. We sat around dinner that night, and all the boarders ate. And I told Billy to tell them his story. He did. And at the end of the meal, I said, now, gentlemen, you look like you need a haircut. And Billy's just the man to do it. So sure enough, everybody there got a haircut. And each of them paid Billy for his work so that he had a little money to go on to Springfield. When he got to Springfield, I met him there when I moved to Springfield some years later. He had become the biggest barber in Springfield. For a while, he was the only one. He called himself the Barber King. And sometimes I would go into his barber shop, and I liked to sit in one of the chairs there. Even if I wasn't getting my hair cut, I would sit. And lots of men would come into the barber shop, and we would trade stories. And I would talk politics, and I would tell jokes. And that was the place where I met many, many people in Springfield. Now, Billy was a good friend to me. When I met my wife, her name is Mary, but I always call her Molly. You know, Molly was refined, and she was elegant. I'm just what you see. But she was really something. Now, she came from Kentucky, the Athens of the West, there in Louisville, and she came, and I met her. We were engaged. But something went wrong, and she and I broke off our engagement. And I felt deathly ill. I was so melancholy. I told one of my friends that if what I had felt at that time, my melancholy, were spread around to the whole human race, my melancholy was so big there wouldn't be one cheerful face in the entire world. Well, I got so sick that my friends thought I was going to die. Billy came over. He left his own wife, and he left his own children, and Billy stayed with me for 10 days till I got well. Now, he was a good friend. We used to sit and talk in his barber shop, and he would tell me what life was like back in Haiti, what little he could remember, and he would tell me about the things that he was doing. Now, Billy was a fine man. He would write poetry. He could play a number of musical instruments. In fact, he was the leader of the band in town. And he asked my advice about legal things, and I helped him buy some property. Do you know when Billy died, he was one of the richest men in Springfield? He was. Well, when I went to the White House, he wrote to me there. And he said, Mr. Lincoln, I appreciate what you were doing there. And he told me I should consider signing the Emancipation Proclamation. I keep coming back to that, don't I? I have to make a decision. I've got to decide whether I'm going to sign this or not. And you say I should.